Let me stream my screen. Alright, everyone join my stream and watch. If anyone has problems joining my stream, let me know so we can get this going. But it should be easy to join. Alright, I'm gonna start now. So, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today basically, as you guys can see from the event title, it's called The Birth of Jesus Under Scrutiny by Suspected. I'm gonna be going over the stories of the birth of Jesus in Matthew and Luke and show the issues with them historically, theologically, and all that stuff. Since, you know, it's the season of Christmas and all that, you know, I thought why not go through these stories, okay? So let's get started. Here's a quick outline of the presentation. First, we're going to be introducing and summarizing nativity narratives. And again, I want to point out to everyone just to make sure to focus up because some of the stuff I'll be going over is complicated. And you need to focus to understand. But of course, you're free to ask questions anytime during the lecture in the text and also on stage after the lecture. But yeah, first we're going to be introducing and summarizing the nativity narratives. We're going to talk about where was Jesus from according to the stories. We're going to talk about Matthew's use of prophecy. We're talking about the Magi and the star in the story, Herod's massacre, Luke's census, Luke as a general historian, Matthew and Luke's contradictions, the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, and the absence of infancy traditions in Christian sources, and we're going to have a conclusion. And yes, it's going to be recorded and posted, and I'll give the link after, okay, to the channel will be posted on. Okay. And guys, excuse any formatting or spelling mistakes in the presentation. Didn't revise it much, but yeah. So first, let's go over outline to Matthew's story, because we have to first remember Matthew and Luke's story are very, very different. Not only are they contradictory, but they're extremely different. Like, they're not related at all, okay? So we need to understand both stories. So here's the outline to Matthew's story. In Matthew 1:18-25, Mary conceives, and Joseph is told by an angel that this is by the Holy Spirit, and he should be named Jesus, and he will fulfill Isaiah 7:14, right? And in fact, before we do that, let me get you guys a quick picture that you guys need to have saved in your heads, basically, right? Look in the side chat, everyone. This is a very important picture, okay? This will let you basically know the geography of everything. If you look at the top of the picture, okay, it's Galilee, that's where Nazareth is. At the bottom is Judea, where Jerusalem and Bethlehem is, and Egypt is of course to the west of Israel, Palestine. Okay, you have to understand this geography to be able to track what I'm saying. Even I'll give you another picture that's easier to track too. Here it is. I should have had a slide for that, but it's alright, no problem. Here we go. I'll put it in the chat as well. This one is maybe a better image or a clearer image. But you need to understand this geography, okay? So you see up there is the Galilee region. At the bottom is the Judea region. And Bethlehem and Jerusalem are both within Judea. And of course Egypt is to the west, okay? So you have to lock in with that. If you forget this geography, you're going to not understand anything. So anyways, as the story continues. So right now in Matthew, they're in Bethlehem. That's how the story in Matthew starts. They start in Bethlehem. And Magi from the east see and follow a star to Jerusalem and tell King Herod about Jesus being born and learn about Jesus through prophecy. Magi meet baby Jesus in Bethlehem and give gifts and then leave, tricking Herod. Then Herod decrees a genocide of all infants in Bethlehem aged 2 years and younger, fulfilling prophecy. Joseph is warned in a dream and escapes to Egypt and stays there until Herod dies to fulfill prophecy. Archelaus, the son of Herod, takes over, so they can't return to Bethlehem, so they settle in Nazareth to fulfill prophecy, right? So a very simple story. It's much shorter than Luke's one. In Matthew, they start in Bethlehem, okay? And then they have to escape Bethlehem after Jesus is born because Herod the Great is basically massacring all the babies. So they have to escape to Egypt. And after Herod dies, while they're still in Egypt, they go to Nazareth and live in Nazareth instead and settle in Nazareth, because they couldn't go back to their home in Bethlehem, according to Matthew. Here's Luke's story. Zechariah, who was told by an angel that his barren wife will conceive and told to name him John. 6 months later, an angel visits Mary and tells her that she will conceive, and so has Elizabeth. Mary visits and meets Elizabeth, and Jesus is praised. Mary stays with Elizabeth for 3 months and then returns home. Then Caesar Augustus, the Emperor of Rome, issues a worldwide census and registration, which requires everyone to return to their ancestral homelands, to where your ancestors from. Joseph, being the descendant of David, who is from Bethlehem, must go there. So notice, and we're going to get to that in a second, in Luke's story, they start in Galilee, in Nazareth, all the way up north. That's where they start. And then they have to go to Bethlehem because of a census that Caesar Augustus issued. Okay? Now, while they go to when in Bethlehem, Mary gives birth in Bethlehem while they're there for the census. Angels visit and tell nearby shepherds about Jesus, and they visit and praise him. 8 days after, Jesus is circumcised per Jewish law, and 40 days after, he's presented at the temple, also per Jewish law, which is in Jerusalem, next to Bethlehem, still in Judea. Then Simeon, the righteous man, and Anna, the prophet, praise him, and Mary and Joseph return home after they are done with their temple rituals. Okay? Those are the two basic outlines to the two stories. You need to track these two outlines, otherwise you're going to be confused when I get into the nitty-gritty details. Okay? First, let's go about where Jesus was from. The idea that Jesus was from Nazareth was a well-circulating and popular tradition. Most academics would say he was probably from Nazareth, historically speaking. The title Jesus of Nazareth is attested throughout the New Testament, and there is no strong theological motivation for these authors to put him there. However, a popular Jewish tradition believed that the Messiah were to come from Bethlehem and rule there just like David. Right? So essentially, it was well known at that time that Jesus was from Nazareth. However, it was also well known that there was this idea or prophecy that the Messiah had to be born where in Bethlehem, right? Even though Jesus was known to be from Nazareth. So Luke and Matthew have their own stories on how Jesus grew up in Nazareth, but also was born in Bethlehem, and they do this in different and contradicting ways, right? And here's a soul from Giza Vermes from Jesus' Nativity, Passion, Resurrection, where he mentions how the locality of Bethlehem, where the Messiah of Israel will inherit the kingdom, is basically the common Jewish interpretive tradition from the Aramaic Targum Jonathan and other places. And yeah. But the issue arises when Christians knew that Jesus was to be from Nazareth, but also wanted him to fulfill Jewish messianic expectations. Both try to give their own stories on how Jesus was both born in Bethlehem but ended up being known to be of Nazareth. Matthew and Luke do this in different and in contradicting ways. They don't just differ in detail, they differ in narrative logic and consistency, right? Matthew's version has Bethlehem be the starting point of Joseph and Mary, as I mentioned earlier. Jesus was born there. The reason why Jesus was born in Bethlehem, according to Matthew, is simply because that's where his family was from, you know? Then Jesus becomes known as Jesus of Nazareth because his family ended up settling in Nazareth when he was a baby, according to Matthew 2:19-23. According to Luke, their home was Nazareth already. But Jesus was born in Bethlehem, down south. Why? Because they had to travel there for the census temporarily. And then they went back home to Nazareth after Jesus was born. So two different stories of where Jesus was from. This is the first issue and contradiction between them. Again, according to Matthew, they are from Bethlehem and they end up settling in Nazareth. According to Luke, they are from Nazareth. They only temporarily go to Bethlehem and go back to Nazareth. But in both stories, Bethlehem is born in both stories, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And if there's any Christians in the chat, by the way, you're free to ask questions in the chat or wait until the presentation's over and come debate me on stage about this and give any objections. Okay. So let's go over the next part. Matthew's use of prophecy. There's one big difference between Matthew and Luke is that Matthew likes to use prophecy a lot, and I mean a lot. He finds a prophecy to use for every part of the story. He gives a prophecy for the virgin birth from Isaiah, him being born in Bethlehem in Micah, Herod slaughtering children in Jeremiah, and other prophecies too. Matthew takes no restrictions in his quotations, misquoting the context of verses, misquoting the texts of verses, changing verses completely, and sometimes making up prophecies that don't even exist. Right? This is from Raymond Brown, The Birth of the Messiah, who's a Catholic priest and a scholar. He says that Jesus is to be related to the scriptures as a commonplace in early Christianity, but Matthew has uniquely standardized the fulfillment of the prophetic word. In finding this fulfillment, Matthew makes no attempt to interpret what we might consider the full or contextual meaning of the Old Testament text that he cites. Rather, he concentrates on features of the text wherein there is a resemblance to Jesus or the New Testament event. Right? So let's go over one example. This is the famous example. I'm sure you guys mostly know it. It's Isaiah 7:14. So he's Isaiah 7:14 in the Hebrew and Greek Bibles. In Matthew it says, "Behold, the virgin Parthenos will be with child, and gastri hexe, and will give birth to a son." Right? These are just the specific Greek words for the parts that are different, and they will call him Emmanuel. In the LXX or the Septuagint, it says, "Behold, the virgin Parthenos will conceive and give birth to a son." In the Masoretic text in the Hebrew, it says, "Behold, the young girl, i.e. Alma, will be with child and will give birth to a son. She will call his name Emmanuel." So obviously here Matthew took mostly from the Septuagint here instead of the Hebrew text to fit his prophecy, and we'll look at why. First, let's go over the context of Isaiah 7:14. The Hebrew form of Isaiah 7:14, the interpretation of this passage by modern scholars may be summarized under these points. So I'm not going to read all of this, but basically you can screenshot this or after I send the presentation as well. These are the summarized reasons why academics take the original context of Isaiah 7:14 to be, right? That it was related to the wicked king Ahaz. It was intended as a sign to this disbelieving monarch during the Syria-Ephraimite war. The child to be born was not the Messiah. And the word Alma used to describe the woman normally describes a young girl who has reached the age of puberty, right, and is thus marriageable. It's not a specific word for virginity. And yeah, so that's the other points too, right? So it's nothing to do with some future Messiah or anything like that. And let's see, did I skip a... Okay, I think I missed a slide, but anyways, we also have Matthew's use of prophecy in Micah 5. So Micah 5 is another prophecy he quotes, and this is an interesting one because, and I'll get to it in a second, but Matthew's version not only differs from the Hebrew, but it differs from the Greek Septuagint too, right? So this is Matthew's version. He says, "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers." In the Septuagint it says, "Are too small to be among the thousands of Judah." And the Masoretic says, "Shall be small to be among the clans of Judah," right? So Matthew, not only does he not take from the original Hebrew and sometimes takes from the Septuagint, but sometimes doesn't even take from the Septuagint at all and just makes up his own version of the prophecy. Alright? But as we see here, Matthew here edits the text of Micah to make it so that Bethlehem is not seen as an insignificant place, but rather the opposite. He does this to further emphasize the importance of Bethlehem in his story and the significance of Jesus being born there. Right? So here's the differences in the different lines. All references to Ephratah is absent. Matthew's purpose is basically theological, right? Matthew categorically denies the insignificance of Bethlehem as is stated in both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. What does this mean? Basically, in Matthew's story, Bethlehem is a very important place. So he takes this prophecy in the Old Testament in Micah about someone being born in Bethlehem, or like the Messiah meant to be born in Bethlehem, and he changes the prophecy so that Bethlehem is not seen as insignificant in that verse, and is seen as actually significant. So as I said, so now we're going to go to another prophecy Matthew misquotes. With Isaiah 7:14, as we said, the evangelist or his editor relied entirely on the Greek Septuagint against the Hebrew Bible, conveniently basing his argument on the Parthenos virgin and not on the Alma young woman phraseology. Coming to Micah 5:2, Matthew felt free to turn his back on both the Hebrew and the Greek scripture in order to create a new text which would be more suited to underpin his case. In Hosea 11:1, he was faced with figurative speech in a poetic passage. In the mind of the prophet, the phrase "my son" does not refer to an individual but alludes to the people of Israel. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about Hosea 11:1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Matthew quotes this specific phrase from Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son," right? Even though the context of this has nothing to do with one specific Messiah or person. It's talking about Israel as a nation as a whole. And we know this why? Because it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him." So it's referring to Israel. "Out of Egypt I called my son." It's actually referring to the Exodus, and when Moses and the people of Israel were called out of Egypt and were saved by God from Pharaoh. And we know this because it talks about them as plural. It says, the more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to Baals and offering incense to idols. So not only is this talking about the children of Israel and not Jesus, it's literally demeaning the Son in this passage. If they attribute this to Jesus, essentially the context would dictate that Jesus worshipped idols and sacrificed idols, which, is blasphemous in both Islam and Christianity. Okay? And and this is the next one. This is the most damning one, right? So Matthew's misuse of prophecy goes so far that not only does he misquote or miscontextualize prophecies for his own purposes, but he has completely made up prophecies in his story too. So this is from Matthew 2:23. What does it say? And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth, so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. This prophecy that Matthew quotes is found nowhere in the Old Testament or any Jewish tradition. It is completely non-existent. Sorry, I didn't fix the grammar of this slide, but that's fine. Basically, Christians try to relate this to Isaiah 11:1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. This prophecy is nowhere near anything like that, the one Matthew quotes, and they make the correlation based on a root word in Isaiah, correlating with the root word for Nazarene being Netzar. Essentially what this is they know this prophecy doesn't exist anywhere. They try to relate it to Isaiah 11:1, and they say the relation is just because, there's one word there that has like a similar root or the same root as the word in Matthew 2:23, so it's referring to the same prophecy. Imagine if Muslims use this level of prophecy or standard, right? This is the same as like when they criticize Muslims for quoting Song of Solomon and saying, because the root word or the word is the same for Muhammad and Mahmadim, etc. This is the exact same thing they're doing here. The exact same thing. So as we can see, Matthew, sometimes he ignores the Hebrew for the Greek to fit his prophecy. Sometimes he ignores the Greek and the Hebrew and changes it to fit his prophecy. And sometimes he makes up a prophecy that doesn't even exist at all. And I challenge any Christian here in VC, any Christian who come up on stage or type in the text and show me where this prophecy is found. So let's look at the next part of Matthew's story, the Magi and the stars. As mentioned before in Matthew, there are a group of Magi that follow a star in the sky and find Jesus in Bethlehem. The Magi are Zoroastrian cultured astrologers. Matthew says they followed the star until Jerusalem, and then the star led them to Bethlehem, and then to Jesus' house. The problem arises is that how can anyone follow a star towards a specific destination? Alright? And I want you guys to think about this carefully, right? For everyone in the audience, right? If you went out at night and you picked a star, any star in the sky, pick any star, any star you like, and you keep following that star, that star will never take you to any specific location or destination. It will just have you traveling in a certain direction until you reach the other hemisphere, right? The northern or the southern hemisphere, or the western or the eastern hemisphere, right? And the story says that basically the star led them to a specific house. I challenge any Christian to show me how you can pick a star in the sky and find a specific house using that star. Because they don't understand that stars, basically, they work like compasses, okay? You have north, west, east, and south. A compass will never take you to a location. It will never give you coordinates. It will never give you a specific town or house. It will just tell you direction, right? If I'm in Australia right now, if I keep going north, I'll end up in Asia. And I'll keep going, end up in Europe and in Russia. And I can keep going, I'll circle around the earth, circle around the earth. But the compass will never tell me, hey, stop in China or stop in Beijing, right? Stop in Thailand. That's not how following stars work. right? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, just like Refutologist said, they followed using Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra. Had better coordination and astronomy than Matthew. So people propose different theories, right? They say this was Halley's Comet. They say it was a planetary constellation. It was a supernova. But again, none of those is going to help you find a specific house. The fact of the matter is the story says that, hey, they used the star to find the house of Jesus. And again, I dare anyone to find someone should find my house using a star. We might as well start doxing each other using stars, bro. Like, that's not how that works. Alright. Next part is the massacre of Herod. So when the Magi go to Judea through the star, they meet Herod the king. They tell them, yo, we're following the star to find this Jesus guy. And Herod finds out and is like, I don't want he's thinking to himself, he doesn't want Jesus, the king of the Jews, to be born, the Messiah to be born. So he orders the massacre of all babies 2 years and younger. This event is recorded nowhere in any source of history, and more so is absent in comprehensive records about Herod, right? Let's read from Raymond Brown here in The Birth of the Messiah. Again, Catholic scholar, right? Catholic scholar. As for the massacre at Bethlehem, Josephus, the Jewish historian, documents thoroughly the final years of the reign of Herod the Great, concentrating on his brutal deeds, yet he never mentions a massacre of children at Bethlehem. We must ask the same question of this story that we asked in relation to the Magi. Is the narrative of the flight to Egypt and the massacre at Bethlehem history, or is it the product of speculation on Old Testament and Jewish themes? Again, this is a Catholic scholar writing this, right? One of the most famous Catholic scholars, Raymond Brown. So essentially what he's saying is that we have Josephus and we have records of Herod the Great, and we have records that go into detail about the bad things they did. But none of them mention this whole genocide that he was committing, right, and killing thousands of people. Which, by the way, again, is an attempt at Matthew to fulfill prophecy. Why? Because he quotes Jeremiah about how people are weeping for the killing of babies and stuff like that, and he wants to apply that to Jesus, and again, he wants to fulfill this. And this goes into the next part, which is Jesus as Moses. The reason why Matthew inserts this story is multi-layered and literarily deep. He uses the massacre of Herod as a plot device to both situate Jesus in Egypt, but also it is part of Matthew's profound theme in the Nativity to portray Jesus' story as the fulfillment of Moses and the Exodus story. Matthew does this by paralleling Pharaoh's slaughtering of infants with Herod's slaughtering of infants, right? So do you guys understand? Basically, Matthew's trying to make out Jesus to be the fulfillment of Moses, right? We know this because throughout his gospel, he keeps trying to parallel Moses. Even in Matthew 17, there's a story of the transfiguration where Moses is talking with Jesus. So essentially, the story of Herod massacring children that he makes up is him trying to parallel with the story of Pharaoh, like how Pharaoh massacred children to try and kill Moses. Herod also slaughtered children to try and kill Jesus. And that's how he wants Jesus to get in Egypt, so then he can also fulfill the prophecy of Hosea 11:1, which says, out of Egypt I called my son. Again, prophecy after prophecy after prophecy that he makes events up to fit. And that's why Raymond Brown also says, I suggest that Matthew did not draw upon an account of historical events, but rewrote a pre-Matthean narrative associating the birth of Jesus, son of Joseph, with the patriarch Joseph, and the birth of Moses. Alright? So that's essentially the internal issues with Matthew's story. We'll circle back to Matthew, but let's get into Luke. Right? By the way, if you guys are confused about anything, I know I'm going fast, but you can ask questions and also it will be recorded so you can rewatch it to understand. But I'm just going through it quickly so we don't take too much time of your time, you know? Alright. So let's go to the Lucan census. As mentioned earlier, the Lucan story is very different. Their hometown in this story and starting point is Nazareth. Luke's method to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem is through a census. I hope you guys know what a census is. It's basically a record or registration of all the citizens of a country or a town or an area, right? Luke says that Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, issued a worldwide empire-wide census where everyone had to return to their ancestral homelands, meaning you must return to the hometown of your ancestors. Luke says Joseph must return to Bethlehem, the city of his ancestor David. He also says this census happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So essentially Luke's story, again to summarize, he says there's this big census that the emperor decreed, and everyone has to go back to the town of their ancestor, the home of their ancestors, to register. And since Joseph is from the line of David according to Luke, David is from Bethlehem, so Joseph must return to Bethlehem or go to Bethlehem, and Jesus ends up being born there. Okay? Now, there's a mountain load of problems with the census. Let's go through them one by one. Firstly, there is no record of an empire-wide census ever being conducted in Roman history. Not only that, but we know this wouldn't have occurred because Judea, at the time, was a client kingdom, meaning Herod had free reign over his land and could not be forced into registrations as a client as long as he paid the territory taxes, right? So this is from Giza Vermes. He says, so if there was no worldwide operation of any kind, was there at least a provincial census in the kingdom of Herod? The answer must once more be in the negative. Herod was a client king, a rex socius, and the Romans did not collect taxes directly from the subjects of such rulers. The Judean kingdom was immune from Roman taxation for as long as Herod lived, according to Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. Okay? So the idea that there was an empire-wide census that included Judea, where Herod was ruling, is ahistorical. Next problem. The next issue is that the census has everyone return to their ancestral homeland. This type of census never happened in history and would be completely nonsensical. And just for you guys to understand, it's essentially saying that anyone or everyone has to return to where their great grandfather is. And I'll ask a question to every one of you in the audience, and you can try and do this as a, as an example to show you how it doesn't make any sense at all. Let me ask all of you, if you had to return to your ancestral homeland, where would you go? And how would you know which ancestor to pick? It doesn't make any sense. Because if I were to return to my ancestors' homeland, how do I know which ancestor to stop? Do I just keep going all the way up until Abraham? Do I keep going until Ishmael, or just only my grandfather or my great-great-great-grandfather? There's no point of an ancestral census. It makes no sense. There would be no benefit to do this, and would be impractical. How could one determine their ancestral homeland? Moreover, this would have nuked the economy of Rome, as stated by scholars like Dan McClellan. Because if everyone were to return to their ancestral homeland, everyone leaves their place of work for weeks or months, the economy of Rome would just completely get destroyed, like worse than the 2008 market crash. And this is also more quotations from Giza Vermes. He says the story appears to conflict with the sensible rules of governing the Roman censuses. They were not required to present themselves in the ancestral city of their clan. In sum, from whichever angle one looks at it, the census referred to by Luke conflicts with historical reality. Some apologists like to refer to the following manuscript. Okay, I'll answer your question in the chat right now. This is not a very wise argument. Are you saying Joseph didn't know where his family came from, his ancestral homeland? Well, he knew where some of his ancestors were from, but how could you tell me that they knew where every single one of his ancestors were from, or their town? And how are you going to pick which ancestor? Because different ancestors are going to have different hometowns. Do you think someone's ancestry goes all the way in the same village? No, right? So how do you know what's your ancestral hometown? It's impossible to determine practically, and it will just become arbitrary. Some guy will be like, oh, I'm just going to return to my ancestral homeland. Okay, that's my grandfather. Okay, that's my ancestor. No, someone's going to say, no, I want to go back all the way to where David was. Someone's going to say, no, my ancestor is Adam. So I'm going to go back to where Adam lived in the Garden of Eden. I'm going to go to the Garden of Eden to register for the census. It makes no sense at all. Let me go back. Yeah, so some apologists like to refer to the following manuscript, Papyrus London 904, and they refer to this to say there was such censuses in history. Here's the text. It says, Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, says, the enrollment by household being at hand, it is necessary to notify all who for any cause whatsoever are outside their homes to return to their domestic hearths, that they also may accomplish the customary dispensation of enrollment and continue steadfastly in the husbandry that belongs to them. They quote this as this showing proof of ancestry censuses, but this makes zero sense because this mentions nothing about ancestral homelands. All this is talking about was just an edict or a decree from the prefect of Egypt that, hey, anyone who's not home right now, go back home because we're doing a census, okay? You know, because people travel for work, people travel for many different reasons, so they had to go back to their homes to register. Go back to where they work, where their home is. Because that would actually be useful information for the government. Not going back to where your ancestral homeland is, which would be completely useless information for the empire. I would dare anyone to give me one good reason why the Roman Empire would want to register all the ancestral homelands of all the Jews. It makes zero sense. And the Roman citizens, which, by the way, they wouldn't have ancestry records of their ancestral homelands. The only reason they knew where David was from is because of the Old Testament. Anyways, the next issue, and probably the biggest issue, is that Luke places this census when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Which is fine, since there was a census conducted by him at this time. However, Quirinius was not governor until 6 AD. And Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So Luke has a 10-year time gap in his story, and that is historically inconsistent. Okay, so we see here, Quirinius became governor of Syria in 6 CE or AD, and Herod died in 4 BCE. Yet Luke says that this story happened during the time of Herod the Great, and while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Can anyone solve that for me? It doesn't fit, and here there's a timeline here. So we see here the red line is Herod's rule, and here this line is Quirinius's rule. Okay. Apologists appeal to different evidences to say that it still does fit. For example, they appeal to this Latin inscription that talks about a governor ruling twice in Syria, and they say this was Quirinius. The general consensus of historians is that this was not Quirinius. It mentions nothing about him, and we already know who was governor of Syria when Herod died at the time. It wasn't Quirinius. So here, some scholars have sought to argue from a damaged Latin inscription, the so-called Titulus Tiburtinus, discovered in Tivoli in the 18th century, that the Roman official mentioned there as having twice served as governor, but whose name is no longer extant, was Quirinius. Even if we accepted this purely hypothetical identification, the period of the first supposed Syrian office of Quirinius would fall in 3-2 BC after the death of Herod. The slot in the governorship of Syria in the final years of Herod's reign are filled by Sentius Saturninus and Quintilius Varus. Since Herod died in the spring of 4 BC, there is no room left for Quirinius to act as the legate in Syria, and definitely none before AD 6. Again, your favorite person, you're not understanding the point. The point is, how do you know which ancestor to pick? I know they knew that David was from Bethlehem, from Old Testament, but who told you that you're supposed to go where David was from? Why are you going 14 generations back? Why not 10 generations back, or only 7, or only 3? Why not 20 generations back? Why not 30 generations back? Can you answer that question? No, you won't be able to. So let's go over and look, Carter, you can keep trolling while the historicity of your text is getting decimated, but I'm just saying. Luke, the unreliable historian. According to academics, Luke's confusion has a historical explanation, in that he confused two major events in the Roman Empire. He confuses two rebellions in the kingdom, one in 4 BC and other 6 AD. This is natural, as even today, with access to the internet and such, we will find trouble easily remembering who was vice president or president in what year, right? So according to the great Roman historian Sir Ronald Syme, the New Testament account is based on Luke's confusion of two notable events in Palestinian history, one dating to 4 BC and the other to 86. Each led to disturbances. The first followed the passing of Herod, and the second, the census of Quirinius. More serious was the rebellion in 4 BC when Varus, the legate of Syria, needed the whole of his army to quell it. However, the crisis of 86 was better remembered because the imposition of Roman rule and taxation triggered off a long-lasting insurrection launched by Judas the Galilean and continued on and off by his heirs up to the great uprising in AD 66. Okay? So this is the explanation that Sir Ronald Syme, Giza Vermes, and Raymond Brown give to why Luke confuses the timeline. Okay? Now, let's give you more examples. This is but a normal thing for Luke. He also has other historical mistakes like the one he makes in Acts. Look what he says here in Acts, and I want everyone to pay attention. In Acts 5, it says, "For Theodos rose up claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. After him," notice it says, after him rose up Judas the Galilean in the days of the census. Luke says the rebellion of Judas the Galilean happened after Theodos, even though the first happened in 6 AD and the other happened in the 40s AD. So Luke is literally writing just a couple of decades from this event, and he still places it half a century wrong. You know, it's like me writing about something that happened 20 years ago, and then, you know, it's something that happened in the 2000s, basically, you know? Like me writing about 9/11 and then accidentally saying that 9/11 happened while, I don't know, RFK was president or something like that, or while, you know, the assassination happened of different presidents. That's the kind of mistake that this is. And here's Giza Vermes again pointing it out. He's just basically saying the same thing I just said. You guys can look at the quotation if you like. Okay, so even though we covered the many internal issues with both stories, let's not forget, not only are they completely different stories, but are also completely irreconcilable. In Luke's story, they start in Nazareth, then go to the Bethlehem for the census. Jesus is born in Bethlehem simply because Mary was 9 months pregnant, which, by the way, is something I didn't cover. But why the hell is Mary going with Joseph to Bethlehem and traveling across Palestine while she's 9 months pregnant, even though she wouldn't be required to as part of a census, because it would only require the father of the household, the husband, to do the registration for her, just putting her through unnecessary suffering and pain. In Luke's story, they start in Nazareth, then go to Bethlehem for the census. Jesus is born, and then 40 days after, they go... Okay, we're not going to be doing some doxing right now. In Luke's story, they start in Nazareth, then go to Bethlehem for the census. Jesus is born, and 40 days after, they go to the temple in Jerusalem to perform rituals. Then after, go back to Nazareth. Where in this story can you fit the escape to Egypt for months? So I want everyone to focus on the image on the side here. The red is Luke, okay? In Luke, they start in Nazareth, in Galilee, up here, okay? And then they go to Bethlehem for the census. Jesus is born. Exactly 40 days later, they're at the temple in Jerusalem. And then Luke 2:39 says, when they had fulfilled everything required by the law, they returned to their hometown in Nazareth. In which phase of this story does this flight to Egypt fit in the story? The answer is nowhere. Right? Because in Matthew's story, they start in Bethlehem, they go to Egypt, they wait till Herod dies, then they try to return to Bethlehem, but they realize Archelaus is ruling, so they can't return, so they end up settling in Nazareth instead. Okay? Doesn't fit. The story doesn't fit in any timeline. Christian apologists like Inspiring Philosophy and others try to reconcile the contradiction by presenting the following chronology. So this is, for example, Inspiring Philosophy's chronology. It says Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Jesus is presented at the temple, okay, 40 days after. And then Luke skips ahead a whole, a whole part of the story And then the wise men visit the flight to Egypt and the return to Nazareth. What inspiring philosophy is omitting here is he adds a little trip back from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. So he adds a trip. He say, yeah, this is issue number one. You have to invent a trip from Jerusalem back to Bethlehem, which doesn't exist in the story, because he says they went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to back to Bethlehem, which is the invented part, then to Egypt, then to Nazareth. That's issue number one. You have to invent a trip that doesn't exist in the story, even though the story says after Jerusalem they went back to Nazareth anyways. Issue 2. According to Luke, Nazareth was their home. So why would they go back to Bethlehem after they are done in the temple? This is the issue with inspiring philosophy's chronology, because he has them go back to Bethlehem after they present him at the temple. But according to Luke, their home is in Nazareth. Why are they even going back to Bethlehem? The only reason they went to Bethlehem is for the census. So they end up going to Nazareth in the Lucan story. And the third issue is assuming this time gap in Luke makes Luke to be a negligent historian and goes against basic storytelling principles. Alright? If I were to ask anyone in the chat about, let's say I was like married or something, right? And then I go to work, and then after work I go out with my friends and we go out to the club or something for like 5 hours, and then I go home after the club at like 3 a.m. And then my wife asks me, okay, where were you? You know, who wrote this guy?
Yo, milk.
Yeah, very funny. Look, Kara, your embarrassment is being recorded, by the way that your Bible's being decimated and all you can say is milk. Look, anyways, as I was saying, if I return home from the club at 3 a.m. and then my wife asks me, yeah, exactly, Marina. But look, let me ask you, Marina, right? Then if you ask your husband, where were you? And then the husband says, oh, I was at work, and then after work I went home. And then you're like, hold on, I saw your location. You were at the club for 5 hours after work. Well, he's like, yeah, that I didn't deny that. I just said after work I went home. I skipped over the 5 hours of the club, but I just went home after. It doesn't matter. I still ended up going home after I finished work. So I was truthful. That's essentially what they're claiming here, because Luke 2:39. This is the verse basically they're trying to interpret. Look at the verse, guys. It says, when they had performed everything according to the law, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. According to inspiring philosophy, when it says they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to the town of Nazareth, it means that they performed the law, and then Herod issued a genocidal slaughter. They went to Egypt, then back to Nazareth. And they went to Egypt for like years or months and had to wait till Herod died. And then they tried to go back to Bethlehem, and they had to get a dream from an angel saying, oh, Archelaus is ruling and you can't go back, and you have to go back to Nazareth instead. And all that happened in this thing that Luke skipped, which would either make Luke incompetent or a negligent historian, or the most simple conclusion, Luke just didn't know or care about Matthew's story. It's that simple. So these are the three issues with the Christian apologist copes around, and I challenge any other Christian to come and explain it to me on stage, okay? Including your favorite person or anyone else, okay? We're almost done here, guys, so let's go over the genealogies. This is just a few extra information about the nativity stories. Luke's genealogy severely contradicts Matthew's genealogy. The following image represents the commonalities between the genealogies and the discrepancies. So the blue here is Matthew's genealogy, and the red here is going to be Luke's genealogy. And if you guys see the bolded words are where the genealogies are in common. Which, by the way, it makes sense that these are the only ones, because these are the Old Testament characters, which they had access to the same Old Testament, generally speaking. Which there's still discrepancies, right? But then look how much of it is not in common. This whole part of the genealogy is not in common at all and contradict each other on, where does Joseph descend from. And obviously, like I said, this also plays into Matthew and Luke trying to force a connection between Jesus and David. Christians, since the beginning of time, have tried to reconcile these differences using different copes. The first attempt we know of is by the likes of Julius Africanus, and I believe Eusebius also followed this similar methodology, claiming that the discrepancies are due to the Leviritic legal marriage system. And this is talked about by academics, and the issue is this only explains a few of the discrepancies, but by no means can explain all of them. As Giza Vermes says, this apparently clever idea turns out to be a failure. It could no doubt account for occasional diversity, but it is unsuitable as an explanation for two lists which disagree with one another so fundamentally on so many points. And also, another cope they try to give, I didn't mention yet, they say that Luke's genealogy is actually about Mary and Matthew's the one's about Joseph. But as I said, this is not mentioned anywhere in the text, and it's clearly Joseph's genealogy, and it's just something Christians invent out of thin air. In fact, it's funny, Matthew goes on to actually mention Mary in the genealogy more explicitly than Luke. So, if anything, Matthew's the one that's with Mary's genealogy. But yeah, the explanation makes no sense. And just a final tidbit on top of the nativity narratives, we have the silence of the New Testament. One of the intriguing aspects of the nativity narrative is that the virgin birth, let alone any part of the whole story of Jesus' birth, is not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament or even in the rest of Matthew and Luke's gospel. Academics even argue the nativity account of Luke, due to different evidences, is a complete addition to the original Gospel of Luke, either by the same or a different author, and that it originally began in chapter 3. And we have intriguing passages to look at. I want everyone to read this with me, right? This is from Mark chapter 3. I believe it is, Mark chapter 3. So this is when Jesus is performing miracles and exorcising demons and so on and so forth. Then he went home and the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. So crowds are gathering around Jesus. He's performing miracles and everything. And look what it says here. It says, when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mothers or brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mothers and brothers? So, according to this story, Mary and the brothers of Jesus were accusing Jesus of being out of his mind and being crazy, and were confused about him trying to exorcise demons and perform miracles. Don't we have a whole 4 chapters worth of story from Matthew and Luke talking about how Mary knew that he was the Messiah, that she received a message from an angel, she was filled with the Holy Spirit, she knew her baby was the King of the Jews, she sang praise about him, but now, apparently, she has no idea that he's the Messiah, and neither do his brothers 30 years later. So Mary just forgot that she literally gave birth as a virgin and miraculously. Nonsense story, right? Or nonsense harmonization between the Gospels, I should say. So clearly, the rest of the New Testament is either unaware or denying this idea of the nativity accounts. And most especially Mark. Okay? Just as a conclusion, in conclusion, as we have seen, the nativity narratives are heavily theologically crafted literary narratives and are heavily ahistorical in their portrayal of events in the Roman Empire in regards to Jesus' birth. Hence why many modern Christians try to focus on the lessons of the story rather than what actually happened. This should tell us a big point about Christmas as a whole. If the whole story of the birth of Jesus is ahistorical in the Bible, why do we still believe in these stories when we celebrate Christmas? Christians should ask themselves that question when Christmas comes around in 2026. And I'll end that off in a quote by Raymond Brown, who is a Catholic priest and scholar of the Bible. In his 700 page book on the topic of the nativity account, which is what I talked about today. He says, we are not dealing with memories from family history, but with a carefully planned dramatization of the theology of salvation history. And with that, inshallah, I'll conclude the presentation. And anyone who wants to come up on stage as a Muslim to ask questions, or as a Christian to challenge my points, you're free to do so now. And just raise your hand and I'll bring you up, inshallah. And I'll wait for you guys to post any questions in the chat or come up on stage. And if not, we can end it there, inshallah.